but it doesn't
in
matter.
case we have so many technical issues. Like on Underscore, the show I do with Marty, one of our first composer interviews, like his laptop crashed and like his interface was all, and we lost some chunks of it. So that was unfortunate. So you can never have too many, I guess.
Yeah, whenever Marty comes on the show, I always get this vibe that he's like the Obi-Wan Kenobi to you guys. He's got this sense of just like, he's got this calm sort of wisdom about him, which, I mean, you guys do as well, obviously, but it's just cool to see him get on.
Marty is like very measured. He's very controlled in the way that he speaks, and he's someone who has taken in a lot of experiences and a lot of life, and I do think he's someone I would describe him as very wise. I think Carl and I on our podcast, it tends to be just very off the cuff. We don't think about things too much before we say them. I mean, I think both of us are kind of thoughtful. We do think about the topics a lot. But yeah, Marty is definitely much more measured. And the thing, just for me, Carl is 8 years older than me, and Marty is 12 years older than me. So I really grew up idolizing them. Yeah. But Marty, since he is so much older, and he often, for many of my formative years, wasn't around the house.
He had a parental kind of role for a while because you were so young.
It's almost like the way that a kid in a divorced family with the dad estranged, they start to like really idolize their dad because he's not around. I don't want to say Marty was a great brother. He was around, but it's just, when I was going into kindergarten, he was starting college.
Right. Except for that one time that he did divorce the family. That was really awkward.
Wow, this just got deep. Do we want to go this hardcore this early into the interview?
We shouldn't.
Okay.
Do not.
Well, I want to ask you guys, what was it about video game music? Because I know, Carl, you also do, you have a band. Is that right?
That's true.
Okay.
Yeah, so I have a funk fusion band in Minneapolis where I live called Carl B. and the Soul Surgeons. And I've been in bands before that ever since I was in high school. So yeah, that's one of the things that keeps me active performing these days.
So I know, obviously, it's not exclusively video game music that you guys like, but what was it about video game music that kind of made you guys want to devote such a huge chunk of your creative life to it? Because you're incredibly prolific. You have tons of albums on your Bandcamp, and obviously the podcast has been going strong for how many years? 5 years? 6 years?
Over 5 years. 5.5. Yeah, I think with video game music, it wasn't ever a conscious choice of like, oh, you know what, I'm going to like this. It just was always there ever since we started playing like Sonic on the Genesis. I remember the day Marty got for Christmas.
My first game.
Yeah, when he got the Genesis for Christmas, and I was probably about 6 or something at the time, and just playing Sonic and Sonic 2 like every day, literally, and just hearing those melodies and those grooves and just really liking them. They just felt really comforting. And then, other games as well, like Aladdin on the Genesis and some LucasArts PC games and Mario and stuff. Yeah, they were just always around, and it was always something that I didn't hear the limitations. I didn't hear, these crappy FM instruments. I just heard pleasing music. And I think later on when I started to write my own music when I was maybe about 12 or so, I started to use a MIDI program called Cakewalk. And I then realized even more just how influential video games were, because the stuff I was writing was very old school video game style. And so, yeah, it's always had a really big imprint on us, all of us, I think.
Will, go ahead, Will.
Oh, sorry. Well, I just think for me, growing up with these older brothers, and I was also playing all of their old games. So I also grew up with kind of the same era of video games and game music that Carl and Marty did, just as sort of a hand-me-down. But I think I had this added benefit. I mean, so much of the music, like Koji Kondo, though those tunes are so catchy and memorable, there's something that, any kid would naturally gravitate to. But also, since my brothers were older and a bit more evolved musically, they were actually able to articulate some things. Like I remember, Marty was always talking about musical concepts. Even when I was really young, he would talk about melody and harmony and these ideas. And so I would hear them in this video game music. I mean, we have old VHS footage of me running around the house as like a 4-year-old, just singing dun 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 Dun, dun,
Yeah,
dun,
Mario
dun, dun,
64
That's
was a big one.
awesome.
I think another thing for me that really solidified video game music as being a legit, like, living, breathing thing was that when I first got my drums when I was 9, I got my first drum set. And ever since then, me and Marty pretty much were jamming all the time. Him on guitar, me on drums, just for years, just in his room. We just had the drum set up, and we would just jam. And we would jam on video game music, like Spring Yard Zone, Green Hill Zone. We would jam on that stuff. And so there was no line between, like, what is real music. It was that was just music that was really fun to jam and to listen to.
Well, I remember when you guys were talking about, I don't remember what episode of the podcast it was, but Will, you kind of had this monologue, which I smile when I hear it, about the end credits of Sonic 2 and how it, like, brought a tear to your eye, especially when he's floating down and then Tails picks him up on the airplane.
Yeah.
And you talked about that
me too.
pixel art and just how it brought back those memories. And
it's emotional.
Dude, I was smiling on my way to work listening to that because I'm 27 and I was maybe 5 or 6 when I got that, and I remember that, and man, I completely relate to that. So aside from
just the way that the music fits with it, it's so beautiful, and then just the animations and it's powerful
the
stuff.
Triumphant like flat 6, flat 7 1 when he finally lands on the plane, it's like perfect. Were there any other key moments, maybe in your childhood, where just video game music just like hit you in the gut with just emotion?
I think credits music in general is a thing that tends to do that. And we've talked about this a lot on our podcast, that I think for some of the early video game composers, they looked at it, I almost imagine it like a play or a musical. And the credits were the moment when, the curtain closes and opens again and the entire cast stands there and bows. It's kind of the breaking of the fourth wall, the acknowledging of the player. And so oftentimes in games, even like Metroid, that credits music is really dancey and upbeat, completely at odds with the kind of dark and gritty atmospheric sound of that score. And I think because of that, a lot of composers, maybe they almost thought like, not many people are going to get to the credits. So I really want it to feel like a party. I want it to feel like this emotional journey. For me, any Koji Kondo credit sequence, whether it's Link to the Past or particularly my favorite is Super Mario World. I mean, the way it really tells a story with that one theme, and it's a theme that you haven't heard anywhere else in the game until that moment, but it's just such a fantastic melody, and the way he paints it, with this sort of straight ahead swung feel, and then eventually there's this up tempo thing, and in the middle there's this slow like lullaby presentation. It's such a beautiful piece how it's composed, and I remember even as a kid I would just be mesmerized by the credit sequence.
Mario 64 was very powerful for both of us.
It's the first thing that made me cry.
That's another example of a new theme that you haven't heard throughout that game, and it's just really pretty, and it's just very poppy, and it just feels good, and that was one that struck us a lot.
Clearing out your locker last day of high school sort of feeling, particularly. I mean, that piece of music, just the rhythms of that melody, the chord progression, it's something that
very sweet.
It touched me when I was incredibly young, and I feel like it can still touch me in the same way. And I'm noticing all the time within my own music, and even when I'm not trying to evoke video game music, like I wrote this choral piece 2 years ago that we performed, and it wasn't until after it was even performed that I realized, wow, so much of this piece is influenced from that Mario 64 end credits, from the chords to the rhythms of the melody. It's just, I don't know, that stuff is such a part of my DNA.
There's a lot of moments like that I can think of. Another one off the cuff is the opening of Secret of Monkey Island. I remember the first time I saw that and I heard that. I was just so blown away and so transported to that island. Melee Island. It's like a
Michael
movie
Land's
too. Music is just so integral to that game. So that was another big one. Also, I remember the first time seeing the opening kind of cinematic to Ice Cap Zone when Sonic is snowboarding down, and that bass line, that groove kicks in. That was just one of the coolest things I had ever heard at that point.
So cool. And then the music perfectly transitions when you go into the cavern.
Yeah,
perfect.
it's just great.
Another good one, I listen to a lot of video game music while I work, and the Wind Waker staff roll was like making my eyes well up with tears.
Yeah.
Because it would bring back the title theme, sort of swashbuckling theme, but then also bring in all the other motifs from the game. And it was just like, wow, this is hitting me right in the feels.
You know what? Speaking of Zelda, obviously there were many more examples throughout my life, but there is a more recent Zelda memory I have. When I was in college, one of my good friends and roommates, his name was Mitch, he got a Wii the day it was released. I went with him to like Shopko or something. We stood in line, and he got Twilight Princess and a Wii. And I remember the first time hearing the Ordon Village theme, I remember just being so comforted by that. Like it was just like another classic, very humble Zelda theme. So that was cool because I hadn't really necessarily played a lot of Zelda games at that point. So for me to kind of really be moved by that was, I think, really impressive.
Yeah. I want to talk to you guys about the way that you deconstruct songs. And you've touched about this a little bit on the podcast, but so there's obviously on the internet there's video game covers everywhere. But you guys are some of the first people that I've discovered that actually create music in the style of a certain video game. Because before I listened to the Super Marcato Bros podcast, I actually found you guys through, I don't remember how, your Bandcamp page, and I listened to Hello World. And what blew me away is not that you guys just like wrote these songs and then put a Super Nintendo sound font on top of it, but you captured the spirit of Koji Kondo. I mean, it was
we wrote it for those sounds too. Like we went out of our way to make something that was from the very beginning written with that palette in mind. And there were a couple of things that I saw online here and there. Mostly very gimmicky, where someone got a sound set and they just thought it was cool to make like a Super Mario Kart song, so they just made something new, but they never really were focused on like kind of capturing the musical elements of that. So there were a few things that I saw here and there, but yeah, we had a very different approach to those projects, and we really wanted to try to imagine a world where there was some alternate reality or some lost sequel of those games, and just try to see if we can go back to that world, really just because we loved those worlds, those musical worlds and those emotional worlds, and we just thought it would be fun just for our own, enjoyment to go back to that. And the fact that other people enjoy it is a bonus.
I think in addition to that, well, first of all, thank you for those kind words, Matt.
Of course, yeah.
That's one of the things that I think I'm most proud of, and great memories that I have collaborating with Carl and Marty on that project. And Koji Kondo is my favorite composer, and I see him up in the ranks of the great classical composers. He's up there, with Tchaikovsky and Chopin to me. And it not even just in, people will say, oh, he writes great catchy tunes. But no, there's a sophistication and a precision to every single note. And that's why I put him among those ranks. To me, I never tire of studying his music. I always can learn something different, and I'm always in awe of his music. So to me, it's a very natural thing to want to, as a composer myself, learn that these are tools, that it's not just about those specific melodies, but he's almost creating a genre. With those Mario scores that he wrote, he was doing so much new that I think we felt, you could write more themes that could almost exist under the umbrella of quote unquote Mario music without, plagiarizing existing themes. And it was a great learning tool because it forced you to understand what kinds of chords is he using? How does he write melodies? We describe his melodies as simple, but are they scalar melodies, or are they just outlining chord tones? You kind of have to dig into what makes this good.
And I
think as a composer, that's the best thing.
To your question, as far as like what was the process, or what is our process for like breaking this stuff down, really what it starts with is taking a piece that we're just moved with, And we might just do this on our own anyway, and just sitting down at the piano and trying to figure it out by ear. That's the best way to learn it. So figure out the melody, figure out the chord progression, figure out the harmony, what's happening at the same time, why does something work, and then figure out maybe the rhythmic elements to it, the bass line, the instrument choice, thinking about why does this ensemble sound good together. But really that's where it starts, is sitting down at the piano and just figuring out by ear. And the more you do that...
Do you notate anything while you're doing this, or is it mostly just
I've done that on
rarely
a couple occasions when for Hello World, actually, before, because the boss battle track was something I wrote. And I wanted to model it after Koji Kondo's piece from Super Mario World, and that was something that really scared me, because it was such a complex, like, singular piece of music. It didn't sound like anything else he'd ever done. You know, it had this progressive rock sound to it, but just the specifics of that kind of like shredding solo, I really did want to deconstruct it by ear. So I actually did create a piece of sheet music for that one, just to kind of as a learning,
which makes sense.
Moment,
it's so specific. Most of the time, no.
Yeah, it is by ear, and part of that is we don't have the luxury of a lot of good sheet music for this. Most of the stuff that you would find online is just by other people, and quite often I'm dissatisfied with the sheet music you find online. It's incorrect, or it's been simplified, or it's kind of someone's memory of it. And particularly in the case of Koji Kondo, or really any of the great 8-bit or 16-bit composers, it's not just the melodies and harmonies, it's the way things are voiced. You know, with Koji Kondo's NES music, for instance, take the Super Mario Brothers theme. The beginning of the A section starts with a C major chord, and we have all three pitches of it, but it's not in a closed position.
Right.
In fact, you have these very spread out chords with the fifth on the bottom, and then the third, and then the root all the way on top.
Right.
And everything kind of moves in parallel. You know, when you play it on the piano, your fingers almost look like they're in a claw position.
Right.
And a lot of times when people play that song or will cover it, not only will they incorrectly, play notes of the melody, but they'll kind of miss the whole character of that spread voicing.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's very eclectic. It's
that's
so
definitely
interesting.
The most well-known video game song, and maybe the most performed video game song, but it's probably, out of anything, the one that gets wrong the most. It's all the time people just don't get the harmonies right. One really important element of breaking down a piece of video game music is getting the voicings. That's one of the biggest learning moments. A lot of times we have access to the actual sound files where we're able to listen to one channel at a time and hear, okay, this chord, this electric piano chord thing is basically 3 different channels. How are they getting these complex jazz changes with 3 channels? What are the voicings they're using? And many times they're very hip voicings that anyone in the world of jazz would really like and agree with. Like, this is a great voicing. And so it's not just the melodies and the harmonies, but it's the exact voicings too. So that's what you
the
can
limitations force you to actually think back to what you would have learned in school or in a theory class, which is understanding the nature of triads or extended chords for that matter. And that really, if you want it to sound like a chord, you need the root and you need the third. So if you only have 3 pitches, you can't have both the 7th and 9th and still have the third. But sometimes, you can have chords that don't have thirds in them or don't have roots. There can be kind of weird chord constructions. So it's really fascinating studying this music. And you also start to notice quirks of maybe a particular company. Like we've talked before, maybe Capcom has a sound or Nintendo has a sound, whether
Sunsoft
it's in their
bass.
Their harmonic language or the implementation of the notes. Sometimes we find with a lot of video game music that is rock oriented, they're occasionally trying to evoke the sound of power chords, which would be like a parallel fifths, or what I find with a lot of the Japanese composers, they really love using fourths, either in like a quartal harmony kind of way, especially if it's supposed to be something scary or ominous. I mean, just listen to the music of Joe Hisaishi if he's ever trying to do like a villainous cue. It's all these kind of barbaric sounding fourths, and I think that had a tremendous impact on a lot of video game composers. People like Koji Kondo or Yuzo Koshiro or Uematsu or really anybody working in games, and that kind of heavy use of fourth harmony interspersed with, you know, thirds and sixths and everything. To me, that's something that I really associate with the sound of video games, particularly, you know, when you're just using a few voices. You can have a rock track that sounds like the melody is harmonized just in thirds, but then you have those certain moments where there are no thirds and they switch to like parallel fourths.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of, obviously, as we've been mentioning, there's a lot of musical things to learn. But the last thing that we were really focusing on, especially for a project like Hello World, was the technical, the ways that Koji Kondo implemented it on the Super Nintendo, and trying to really listen to those and emulate those as closely as we could.
Yeah.
The way he uses vibrato, the way the range that he uses certain instruments. He'll never go above this note on this instrument, so let's not do that, because otherwise it won't sound like Mario World. So listening to how those composers implemented on the very hard limitations of the time, that's the last thing that is really valuable to learn.
So would you say, for a beginner, to really nail the composition and arrangement first before moving toward things like implementation and sound design?
Absolutely.
I completely, that's how I feel.
Okay.
I feel like you can't be good at all of it right away, you know? I think the implementation, the production side in general, is something that takes a long time to develop. You really have to develop your ear, and you really have to develop an ability to listen for subtleties in music. But while that's happening, you shouldn't waste your time. Like, keep writing. I mean, you have to start making music that sounds terrible at first, and maybe it'll have good melodies there. Maybe the actual material will be good, hopefully, but it might not sound very good, and that's okay. You just have to keep going, and eventually you'll get there.
I really agree with Carl in the sense that I think sometimes people don't appreciate that really to be a musician and create a finished product requires all these separate tasks. It's not just one job. And so people think, you know, I'm getting better as a musician because I'm spending time, you know, maybe I'm learning how to use FL Studio or something, and now I'm becoming a musician. But you're only learning one of the responsibilities of being a musician. And for me, I feel like if you want to write music, if you want to be a composer, you need to understand pitch, you need to understand melody, harmony, arrangement, orchestration, these kind of concepts that relate to all disciplines of music. And I think, like Carl said, you don't need to learn one first and learn. You should be doing everything simultaneously. But I think the danger of focusing too much on the technical aspects first is it can be very influential into the way in which you write. And so if you're someone with a lot of facility but not a lot of knowledge about how music actually works, like on a theory level, I think you'll quickly find yourself going down the same types of corridors again and again. The same way that people that just rely on like if they have bad piano proficiency, maybe if they don't challenge themselves, a lot of their music will kind of reflect that, and the chord choices they use will be the result of just
also
what they can physically do with their fingers.
There'll be there won't be melodies that will be that complex because they couldn't play those melodies to begin with. Another thing is like forcing yourself to, in addition to learning the fundamentals of music, forcing yourself to listen to and critically listen to as many different genres of music as possible. And if you force yourself to write in genres that are outside your creative box, then you're going to learn new things. Like, let's say you love rock and you have a guitar and you have an M-Box and you have Pro Tools and you like recording rock songs and that's all you do. Try to write a jazz song. You might not know anything about jazz, but listen to it. Try to figure out what kind of chords are they using. Why does it sound the way it does? You'll learn a lot of things that you could then apply to rock and apply to a lot of genres. But if you don't go outside your comfort zone, you're never gonna evolve.
Well, and I really agree with that, Carl. And it's almost like it's similar. Understanding using different chords are just like any great tool. It's kind of like understanding the orchestra. It's a lot to manage, to tackle, all the types of interesting harmonic things you can do is really daunting, the same way that looking at all the different instruments in the orchestra is daunting. But really, you can communicate a lot just with a flute. You can communicate a lot just with a violin. And so I think, you don't need to learn every kind of crazy chord before you get started.
Sure.
Just knowing one thing that's maybe a little bit spicy, it gives you a point of contrast. Maybe if you were just playing with diatonic chords and you learn this one chromatic chord that you understand and you can use consistently for a certain emotional effect,
Sure.
It just opens up a whole new broad set of colors. And I mean, I find myself still I'm constantly learning new harmonic choices, and it just comes from listening to music, studying music, and
when I think about that question, as far as like what's the best way to get started in composing, maybe what are some things that aren't as useful, or maybe what's important, what's not important. The more I think about it like tools in a toolbox, and the more tools you have, the bigger toolbox you have, the better composer you're going to be. And some examples of tools will be listening to different genres of music and trying to replicate those techniques, knowing a lot of different kinds of chords, a lot of different kinds of tonalities, major, major, minor modes, things like that. Also, owning different mics, owning different pieces of software and virtual instrument. Those are all different tools that you can add to your tool belt, but you should always be trying to expand that tool belt. And you should never just stick with, I have these three and that's what I have, and I'm not interested in learning anymore.
Along with that, and something that specifically I would say pertains to Carl's music, and I think the music of any good composer, it's not just understanding melody, chords, rhythm, all these things. The concept of whether you want to call it orchestration or arranging, to me, video games were a great learning tool because of the limitations. Composers had to be very economical and communicate very succinctly. So maybe it's just every monophonic channel has its own specific function, and you start to understand what is the role of a bass instrument, what is the role of a supporting instrument, what's the role of a melody instrument. And once you get into Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, they still couldn't have lush elaborate orchestrations, but you start to notice there's a principal element, like a melody element, there's a bass element, there's a percussion element, and then there's something that's not only giving chords, but it's giving groove, and everything has to lock in together. I say this relating to Carl because I think one of his great skills in kind of his retro or chip music type of stuff is there's usually a lot of things going on simultaneously. It's not that it's simple where there's maybe
very Masato Nakamura-esque.
Yeah, like Carl, you just made that video for that song, like Fly the Coop.
Fly the Coop, yeah.
And he has he's sort of filming all of the different parts that are going on, and there's multiple guitar tracks, there's all these different keyboards and synths, and it doesn't sound like that's too much.
Chaotic.
Everything locks in with each other.
That's
a really big skill, and it doesn't just apply to writing for a big band or writing for an orchestra. It applies on every level. Understanding the fundamentals of like what is the missing energy, what isn't there that can be added to give a little bit more rhythmic color or flavor to the harmony.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that is one of the most important things that you can learn from video game music, and you can learn it from a lot of different genres. It's almost like it's a puzzle, right? There's all these puzzle pieces that interlock together, and certain pieces won't fit, right? And so it's about coming up with an entire picture. Like when you finish a puzzle, it's made up a lot of different puzzle pieces, and it looks really beautiful. But it only works because the pieces fit together in the right way. So listening, how can you really have, in some ways it's weird on paper, a bass, a melody, drums, chords, a counter line, an arpeggio, a pad, maybe a separate riff, a harmony. How can you really have all that happening at once and not make it sound just like absolute mush? It's not easy, right? You have to try to figure out a way for, like what Will was saying, the different energies, right? So like if the bass has a certain rhythmic energy or harmonic energy, you might want to contrast that with another element. You don't want things to get in the way of each other. So really it's just kind of like building a really complex musical puzzle.
Now, is that process for you, Carl? Because I know I've listened to all your Sonic Asks albums. They're fantastic, by the way. I'm not just
thanks,
saying
man.
this. They could absolutely be Masato Nakamura songs. Will, wouldn't you agree,
much.
Will? I know you believe it.
I very much agree.
Yeah.
In fact, when Carl started writing those albums, it was like this time where he had just finished college and was living
before
at home
Marcato
again.
Bros. Yeah.
And that was one of the things that was hugely inspirational. So I know Marty as well. Also, the idea of like, what if you wrote original music going back into the style of an existing composer? And all of us love Sonic so much that I remember just being really excited, what was Carl going to do next? And also learning the tools of how to create Sega Genesis style music.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in some ways it was this really weird proof of concept. We're like, whoa, like what if you actually tried to go back to that style? And getting the first step was we found this VOPM plugin, which was like eye-opening, that we could hook it up via MIDI, our MIDI keyboard, and boom, you're hearing the actual like Sega bass that you grew up with. And, and so that was so inspirational, and that just kind of that fun and inspired energy really just propelled me to make those.
Well, the thing that I will give a great, and I don't want to say a defense, but something that I think Carl did, particularly in the first Sonic-esque, that I don't think any other composer that's ever worked in the Sonic series has captured, is that Sonic music, to me, especially when Masato was doing it, it had nothing to do with speed. It wasn't about being fast or rocking or edgy. It was about being cool.
Yeah.
And to me, a cool piece of music is something that's funky and laid back and groovy.
Absolutely.
And I know it's at odds with the fact that Sonic is supposed to be running a mile an hour, but to me, the music in those games wasn't so much focusing on it wasn't so much focusing on the character of Sonic and the action of the level. It was focusing on the environment.
Yeah.
And the atmosphere that you're just supposed to experience playing the game. And so I remember when Carl made that first album, there were some comments at first that would be like, this stuff is too slow. This doesn't sound like Sonic.
Right.
And when you go back to Masato's original demos for the first two Sonic games, some of the stuff is so incredibly slow, much slower than even what ended up happening in the game. And I think Carl sort of nailed his compositional voice much closer than
I do
of the music in that series.
I will say that I did take some of those comments to heart with the second volume, and if you listen to the second volume, it's just way faster, and it's almost like I'm on caffeine that whole volume. And I do think that I maybe went too far, and eventually I found, like, I think volume 4 is the right balance of there's tracks that are laid back, there's tracks that are frantic, but it just overall the balance feels right. So there is a balance for sure, but it took a while to kind of get that balance. I think volume 1 was honestly just, I wasn't thinking that much about what I was doing. I was just having fun making music, and hopefully that came across.
Carl, you definitely have a style. Like, I listened to Micro Power as well, which is fantastic.
Carl has a style.
You've got this funk that colors like all of your compositions. It's just this distinct, like, soloing in a smoky bar kind of thing on a piano, like this funk. And even when you're writing like some of you guys' softer compositions, I can tell when you're doing something on there, Carl, because it's just got this funk edge, whether it's two or three notes. It's just and it makes you guys' style very, very distinct, and I like that. You mentioned earlier that it's very difficult to put like an arpeggio, a pad, a harmony, a melody, a counter melody, all that stuff without sounding like mush. So how does a beginner do that? Like, how do you think through that? For you, is it like trial and error? Like, I put this part in, it sucks, I take it out.
He's also a drummer, so he has this physical experience and relationship with mixing together all these different sounds and all these different parts and different rhythms, and
I do think
putting them into a soup.
That, Matt, you nailed it though. It is trial and error, because when you start off, you're gonna try a lot of dumb things that don't work. Remember those times. Remember, okay, something about this arpeggio, it doesn't work. The best way is if you can figure out why it doesn't work, and there's a good reason why. There's not a lot of reasons. There's only a few reasons why it won't work. It's either because some note is clashing with the chords that's happening at the time, a note that's outside. Let's say if you're playing a C major chord on a pad and the melody's evoking that, if your riff is going between F and E, the F is clashing. Okay, that's one possibility. Another possibility is that rhythmically it's clashing. It's not lining up with the groove that's established elsewhere. There's only a finite number of reasons why it will or won't work. So ideally you can try those out, figure out the times it does work. Why does this work? For example, one thing that I have been thinking about the past few weeks is Hakushi Hashimoto, because we had an episode on him recently, and this awesome little arpeggio that he has in the Racing Hero BGM1, this din 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 din. It's this repeated arpeggio that doesn't really change. But if you listen to that song, there's these complex jazz chords that go all over the place, but the riff doesn't change because he figured out what notes are in common between all these chords.
Yeah, exactly.
And so he's using those common notes to kind of provide a different level of context between them, and it's just brilliant.
And the difficult thing about theory is the more advanced you get into it, this sounds like a cliche because music people love to say this all the time, that there's no such thing as a wrong note, but it kind of is true. It's all about context and setup. You know, I mean, in a certain sense, you know, playing an F sharp pitch over a C major chord, you know, if you're soloing or something, that might sound like, oh, mistake, wrong note.
Right.
But if
you lead
that's
into it
prepared in the right way, then it starts to sound almost like Lydian, or there's this kind of weird tritone in the mix.
For example, let's say it's a C major world and the chords, everything is C major. Oh, you can start a melody on E flat if you go to E after and you make it this kind of cool
chromatic
jazzy grace
leading
note.
Tones and everything.
That stuff is all fine. It's just about the context and setting it up and making sure that you're like making a package for the listener that's very comfortable and they know exactly they're treated well, right? So that E flat doesn't just stay in E flat. It resolves nicely to a chord that is in the chord.
There's one thing I wanted to say, because Matt, you talked about Carl having a style, and I completely agree. And before I even started writing music, I was a fan of Carl, and I do think his style has been there. I mean, he's gone maybe in certain directions in terms of instrumentation, but in terms of a sheer musical identity, the types of chords that Carl is drawn to, he loves a lot of minor sevenths. That's like when I think of a minor seventh. Favorite. I think of Carl. Like, to me, he's owned that chord for me. And also with his melodies, there's a lot of little touches, but one of the things that I notice the most with Carl, and I love this, is it'll be a melody where in classical music, sometimes they use the term antecedent and consequent phrases, which basically just means, you know, like a melody that proceeds and it has a half cadence first and then it proceeds and has, you know, a finished cadence the second time. With Carl, he'll write a lot of melodies where it's based around a central nugget. For instance, one of my favorites is da 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 da. Da 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 da, where like it goes up the second time and it goes down the first time, and that's something that I really love. And there's sometimes when Carl will do it where I'll just be like, oh, that's such a Carl moment.
He just called you.
Well, first of all, thanks for that, Will. But I think one reason I think that's cool is because I think we both relate to that in each other's style. And that's one thing that I always really enjoy in your music is the way that you take a sequence or a nugget and you manipulate it the second time. So I think we both have a way of really thinking about how are we going to take this idea and mutate it over time. I think we probably do different things and probably approach it in a different way.
But I feel like I know my brothers pretty well, and there's sometimes when I'm writing a piece where I'm like, oh, Carl's going to like this because it just sounds like a Carl moment. And I have a lot where I'm writing something where I'm like, oh, I think Marty's going to like it. And sometimes when I show it to them, they may like it, but they don't necessarily hear their own thumbprint in it. And I think that's sort of fitting. That's what makes it genuine. If he was aware of his own voice, it kind of wouldn't be genuine. What I love about listening to a piece of Carl is it's like when he's really being vulnerable with himself and he writes a melody that only he could write. I don't know. I find that to be some of my favorite stuff. And I mean, I really like both of my brothers as composers. I think they're both really talented and very different.
without getting too mushy, I mean, I think we all feel the same way about all the other two brothers. We just have so much, respect for one another, and I think we're all three of us are very lucky that we have these other people that we're so close with that we can be inspired by and kind of root for. And yeah, I mean, I definitely second that with Will and Marty. I couldn't have, more inspiring brothers to listen to their music and try to be partners with them.
I didn't get to tell you, I do love that song, Fly the Coop. It's really amazing.
Thanks.
I left a comment on YouTube because I liked it so much. I figured rather than text you, I would make it public information.
I need those likes.
That's
I need
right.
Those comments.
Yeah. Helps with the SEO a little bit. Might as well show the SEO
I had
love.
fun making that. That was my new experiment with. I recently got a GoPro, so that was my first kind of experiment.
I'm gonna have to check that out. Did you tweet that, Carl?
I think I did. Yeah,
All
it's
right,
called Fly the Coop.
out.
So that's on my YouTube channel. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So here's an interesting question. So let's say I'm a beginner. I'm a semi decent musician. I can hold my own on the keyboard.
Is this true? Is all this true?
I don't. You would probably have to be the judge of that. I don't know. I guess I would call myself at least semi decent. The semi is very important there.
I have a feeling you're being humble.
Well, I am the most humble man that I know.
No one is more humble than me.
That's right. So, if $1 million were on the line and you had to teach me how to write a video game song, like any sort piece of video game music, in a month. Okay, so I don't know anything about video game music. $1 million on the line.
Originally,
where would you start?
Well, originally I thought that the $1 million was like, oh, you would need that much as a budget to teach you. But now you're saying it's just motivation for me to do a good job of teaching, right?
Exactly. Let's say you get $1 million budget and $1 million if
because my first
succeed.
reaction was you don't need $1 million to teach someone that. But if that was on the line, I would probably do a much better and efficient job of teaching.
Well, there you
think
go.
It's all about if you, as the student, are open and really want to succeed with that. If you're open to it and you're willing to go outside your comfort zone and just push yourself, it's very possible. Hopefully you have some sort of raw musical ability where you have an ear and you can hear what note sounds good and what doesn't sound good. As long as you have that, I think it's just about giving you a lot of homework and almost like you're taking like a really big load at college, right? You just listen to a lot of music all the time. Try your best to find moments that you like and figure out why they work. And obviously I could give you some examples of that and try to show that to you, but you do have to hear that for yourself. You do have to realize, I like this sound. There's a reason why, and I can probably replicate it again. And that's kind of where I would start. I think the bottom line is, though, you would have to just, if I had a month with this person, I would make them write every single day. Even if it's bad, I would try to take their little idea, even if it is terrible. How can we improve this? How can we get it better? And every time you come up with a new idea, it should get better and better. I think it's a fun experiment. I like the idea of it.
I think there's a couple things. I think first of all, it's difficult to. No one's going to achieve mastery in a month. No one's gonna get to a point where it's just a result of time. And I mean, I have so many memories of someone explaining advanced theory concepts to me, and it was just like gibberish. I wasn't ready for it yet. I couldn't take in all that information. So, but I was still writing music at the time, and I think some of it wasn't half bad. So you're always learning, but I think what I find is the more you're learning, for at least my disposition, I really want to create. Once I've learned information, I want to put it to use. And so I think if I were teaching someone, I would maybe want to make sure that there's a focus on them creating and looking at that, but also a lot of emphasis on, I would spend probably way more time on us examining the music of other composers and breaking down their chord structures, breaking apart why their arrangements work, why a melody is good. I would spend probably 90% of the time doing that and maybe letting them have their own time we're composing. And I mean, I think giving critiques to that are going to be important, but I think the most important thing, especially in like an early stage, is understanding other music and figuring it out.
But again, whether it's a month, whether it's 5 months, it's possible to to get someone to a point where they can make a really good piece of video game music in a month, but it would need to be someone who is going to be just dead set on getting to that goal and listening every single day, writing every day, trying to just get inch closer to that finish line.
Well,
so it depends on how motivated the student is.
Well, and it's also about context, you know. Why is Chemical Plant Zone a good piece of music, but also why is it good for that level, and why does it feel good in that game? And that's something that I think those of us that love game music don't often do enough. We forget that this isn't just fixed music. It's like film music, or, you know, opera or theater or any kind of music that's meant to support a story. And I think games are often not appreciated in so many levels. But I mean, the best video game music is also telling a story on top of all of the other amazing things that it's doing musically.
Right, because I think if you take a piece, just any random piece of good video game music, it's possible that it was from a very talented composer who has a lot of natural instincts, and they went with those instincts and made something pretty effortlessly that is good. Or the other hand, whether or not it was that same talented composer, it was the product of a lot of hard work and perseverance, and taking something that, oh, this works, this doesn't, how can I tweak it, how can I get it better? So, and if that's possible, then I think as long as you have some musical ability and you have an ear for what sounds good and what doesn't sound good, I think it is possible to make good video game music. You just really have to work hard.
What's something that you see novices, and this could be in the video game composing world or just in the composition world? I'm sure, Will, you are around a lot of composers being at school for it.
A lot of novices.
Yeah, a lot of novices. What's one thing, either on the internet or in person, that you see novices focus on that's a gigantic waste of time?
You know what's interesting? I've talked about this with Marty for years. I know that we're on the same page, and I can only imagine Will's on the same page. It definitely has to be so much focus on getting the best gear, getting just the right microphone and the best computer, and what software is the best. None of that matters. None of that matters, because there's great music that was just made with the crappiest equipment.
Famitracker. You download Famitracker for free.
You don't need the best equipment to make good music, and good equipment doesn't equal good music.
Right. And I think the asterisk to that point is it doesn't matter if the music isn't good. If the music is good, I mean, all those tools have uses, but chances are, if you're someone who's just interested in collecting more and more stuff, you don't actually have a facility with any of those tools. Yeah. So a really it would be like a violinist who can't bow with a nice tone, who can't play with intonation, and giving them a Stradivarius. It's a waste of that tool.
Sure.
I feel really strongly about this. If I were going to, start some sort of school and have like a specific philosophy on how to teach people composing, I think it's much more useful to just pick, either whether or not you pick it or someone else picks it, just pick a small finite set of this is your tools, this laptop, this piece of software, these 3 mics, this interface, this set of virtual instruments. That's it. Try to make the best music you can with those. When you outgrow those tools and you really feel like what you have in your head you can't accomplish with those tools, then start to expand. But you got to start with somewhere. And like for me, it was on Cakewalk with general MIDI, just literally inputting with a keyboard, inputting the notes. Yeah. Terrible 90s general MIDI sounds. That's all I had. I tried to make the coolest songs I could with those sounds. Right. And if I had access to just what we all have access to now, I don't think I would have been as good of a composer.
Well, and I think it's kind of what I was saying earlier, where these are separate disciplines. I mean, understanding the tools and understanding technology is important for a composer, living in the 21st century.
But it comes in time, I think.
You need to understand music first. What I encounter with a lot of novices is, to me, what it sounds like a lack of commitment to an idea. That they're going in one direction, maybe with a melody, and then it's quickly abandoned short after. And there's no sense that these things were composed in a fluid manner. It's
Why do you think they do that?
They did those 2 bars, and then they do these 2 bars. I think what happens is sometimes maybe it's people where they're not actually playing things out. They're not again, this is why I think the technology thing, writing on the technology before you can really play an instrument, is a very dangerous thing, because it plays it back to you. And if you're not really discerning, you can hear a really dissonant chord moment. And like we said, since there are no such thing as wrong notes, from a certain point of view, it can sound good. From a certain point of view, it can sound interesting, even though if it's not what you set out to do. That's why I like Carl's idea. When you set specific parameters, it forces people to be self-critical, and not so much do I like it, do I not like it? Is it working? Is this effective? Am I communicating what I set out to communicate?
Because if the goal, I guess, if the goal is to make good music that other people will enjoy as well as hopefully you will enjoy, if that's the goal, then I can tell you unequivocally, you do not need the best gear to do that. Yeah. You can get it done with a very small amount of affordable tools, because really that's how all three of us started. We started with bare bones. Back when Marty started, there wasn't as much there wasn't as much like maybe digital recording. So he had a 4-track tape recorder, and he just had a pretty bad acoustic guitar. He made demos with that. He made decent sounding recordings with that.
For me, the quality of those songs has nothing to do with the recording, because he could perform it live, and there's no recording, there's no technology being involved, and it's still a great piece of music. And I think sometimes we forget that music was originally created to be experienced acoustically in a live situation, and the recording process is meant to approximate that.
Sure.
Another aspect that I think that's very true, as far as like don't get too bogged down with getting the best gear, is when you talk about capturing human performance. Yeah. If you're either an individual musician or a band, and you are good performers, and the music is actually good that you're playing, and you are good at singing and performing, whatever it is, focus on that and try to have a good performance. It's if you capture a good performance, it's good. It sounds good.
Sure.
You can set up a few mics and do no editing, and if the performance is rock solid, that's what happens with a lot of jazz recordings. It's just live recordings.
Like, why do we prefer live albums of our favorite bands?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily that it needs to be this polished thing. The performance should be great, and if the performance is great, then it's gonna be great. You don't have to worry about anything else. At the same time, if you have a performance that has a lot of issues and you bring it into your DAW and you try to tweak it and edit it and fix everything, you could, with a lot of work, get something that sounds good, but it's going to be much harder and much more expensive.
Well, and I think one of the reasons we're such advocates of video game music, I mean, those of us that grew up with it, yes, we have this nostalgic fondness for all the sounds, but stepping back objectively with the lens that I think a lot of non-gamers take to game music, you're dealing with crappy sounds, these primitive synthesizers, especially with the early stuff. Now, I like that. I can't really be objective about what component of that is my true aesthetic value of those things and what is simply nostalgia. But the point is, it's good because the music is good.
Sure.
Those instruments, even if you like them, they definitely are not good enough on their own to communicate anything, which is where I think a lot of modern chiptune composers might fall short, is they're misunderstanding what was good about the music that they love.
No, Will, you bring up a great point. Almost out of any musical discipline, I think video game music can be the most inspiring as far as look what we can do with these limitations. So don't get too concerned with, in some ways, purposefully don't get good equipment. Just try to download one DAW, maybe a couple virtual instruments, a way to work on music either with MIDI or with sequence, whatever you prefer.
There's so many ways of manipulating something. You can get all these virtual instruments, but it's if that's what it's about, people tend to just accept what they get out of the box. I like this sound, I don't like this sound. Where when you have very limited resources, it's kind of like a carpenter who has a very small toolbox. They start to maybe use the other side of the hammer for a different, you know, it's like when you just have a few basic sounds, you might start to get into equalization and what timbres and frequencies can I boost to affect the sound of this instrument? Can I add reverb? Can I add effects? You start to be sculpting your sound in a way that you don't when you're just kind of have this plethora of sounds, and you just kind of, I like it, I don't like it, I don't like it, you know.
Sure.
Well, also it's a win-win, because look what you're doing. You're learning those new techniques to make that thing sound good that you wouldn't have had to do if you had a more expensive mic, or if you had a more expensive preamp or something. So you're trying to make something sound good with limited resources. It's going to force you to learn more tricks. It's going to make you a better engineer, a better musician. So yeah, I think we all feel really strongly about limitations are a good thing. Limitations in equipment, limitations in voices, limitations in technology. Limitations are a very good thing, and it's a great tool to kind of get your creative juices flowing.
Yeah, I think that's a very like kind of carrot on the stick thing, having the perfect gear. There will always be a better preamp, there will always be a better DAW, that sort of thing. But if I may, at risk of directly contradicting what we just talked about, if we can get geeky for a second and maybe talk about some of you guys' maybe some resources, some software that you guys use, any programs, plugins, things like that.
To be clear, we're not trying to diminish those, but those are, I guess we think those are things you have to earn, right? You have to get to the point with where you're growing towards them. Yeah. That's
when Marty owns a recording studio in Wisconsin. So, I mean, we're, all of us are, can be quite particular about that stuff. But I think it's important to almost on a regular basis, routinely remind ourselves that this is one of the things that made me want to be a composer in general. Like the idea of the real book. I became fascinated, not with it from like a jazz performance standpoint, but that the idea that you could take the essence of a song and put it into a page. Just visuals. You can notate what's the melody and what the chords are, and then you write the name of the song on top, and that's the song. And there's something to me, I like that. I think some of my favorite music can be treated that way, whether it's a Koji Kondo piece or a John Williams theme, or a great classical melody. I mean, I know not all music functions that way, and sometimes it really is the sum of its parts, and it is all the little details, and we talked about voicings of chords and everything. That being said, I do think when those primary aspects are all firing, melody, harmony, and rhythm, you can kind of condense it into this thing, and it doesn't need flashy tricks. It doesn't need a great instrument. It doesn't need technology. You can just be reading a chart and plunking chords out on a piano and, you know, singing a melody, and it's like, that's a song, and it has this identity, and it makes you feel a certain way. I
think having the right tools, having the right gear is a way to sometimes bring those ideas to fruition and bring them as far as they need to go. Right. There's a couple of pieces of equipment that all three of us could not live without. The first being our DAW. All three of us exclusively use Reaper. Okay. So when it comes to actually producing and recording music, that we could not be bigger fans of Reaper. It's just everything we ever really needed to do, it can do. Sometimes it's maybe a little bit more involved and tedious than other software would be, but you can get the results that you're looking for.
Sure. So I find it so much less tedious than like Pro Tools. I mean, I haven't used Cubase or anything, but
I've used a lot of different DAWs, and nothing comes close to just how smooth and fluid Reaper is. And Reaper is always trying to work with you and trying to make your job easier, and they give you so many different options to do that, whereas a lot of the other DAWs, it feels like you're fighting against it to try to do what you want it to do. So that's one thing. A couple other things personally that I couldn't live without. When I make video game music, the two biggest pieces of software that I use would be FM Drive. If I'm going to do Genesis stuff, I just adore that. Also, Chip Sounds I use all the time, and that's just a wonderful tool to make a wide variety of chip stuff. There's a lot of customization. It's MIDI, so that I get to write something by playing it on a keyboard. So for me, that's the best way to write. I'm not big into trackers. It's just not something that ever works for me. I know Will is more into that world. Having some sort of keyboard is I could not compose without that. A MIDI keyboard, also a mini keyboard, a small little Casio. That I would not be a good composer without that thing, because sometimes you're away from technology, and if you're laying in bed and you have your mini keyboard next to you, that's the time when maybe an idea strikes. also the voice memo feature on iPhones.
Love
we
that
would be
thing.
nowhere.
Yeah, love that
we would
thing.
be nowhere without that.
Yeah.
So those are
the
just
Casio
a few.
thing is important for video game music. It's a way of getting you into the right headspace. But
Sure.
even for non-video game music stuff, it's sort of humbling. It forces the ideas to be good and not relying on any kind of timbre. Like I started coming up with these ideas for a new choral piece yesterday. Just in the morning, I was playing my little mini Casio keyboard, and I think a lot of people would be like, oh, those sounds are so bad. But again, I think most of us, the average person in the 21st century, at least in America, because that's all I can speak for, I think we're so much more literate in sound than we are in music. We're so used to hearing like, oh, that sounds cheesy, that sounds good. And it has nothing to do with the music and has all to do with the timbre, the fidelity, the production.
Sure.
And I think I like those things that force me to listen to the music, to listen to the pitches themselves, and not so concerned with the quote-unquote sound, even though that is a part of a composer's responsibility.
Sure.
So I really agree with Carl in that regard. I am, as far as trackers go, for me, Family Tracker is the only one I'm proficient in, and it's the only one I really care to be proficient in, because I really... The NES is something where I do actually have a huge fondness for all of those sounds. There's a simplicity to the 3-channel thing. Also, a lot of people that write for Family Tracker, they like to use the extensions VRC6 and really make it as wild and epic as possible. I really like the idea of making something with just the 3-pitch channels, because compositionally that's what is so great about so much of that early music. So if I'm trying to do something like that, that goes away when you have 5 or 6 channels. So that's something that's important to me and why I use Family Tracker. I also use Reaper, like Carl said. When I'm doing orchestral stuff, I will tend to use East West Quantum Leap, Hollywood Strings, occasionally brass. I'm very partial to the company Cinesamples.
Okay.
They have so many fantastic products. They have, I think, some of the best woodwind and brass samples around.
And solo string stuff.
They have some great, solo instruments. They have, there's this one I have called Randy's Celeste, which is modeled after a specific keyboard synth player, and it's basically the sound of the celeste that you hear in Harry Potter, which is a synth celeste that mixes samples with synth elements.
Wow.
They're fantastic. I use their stuff all the time, and they're actually all very affordable relative to a lot of other virtual instrument libraries, and pretty much ready to go. There's much less kind of massaging and sculpting that stuff. So I find myself using that all the time.
That we are big fans of. We're really big fans of free plugins that offer a lot of control. There's a lot of great free plugins out there. If you're trying to save money and try to develop it as like an engineer, get as many free plugins as you can and try them out, because there's a good chance some of them will work for you. One of the ones that is all over all of our music is there's a free reverb plugin called Epic Verb. We've been using it for years. And like I would say 95% of anything you hear that's not maybe like Chip from the Marcato brothers, it's on there.
Yeah.
It just has so much control, and it just has this way of adding just the right amount of kind of depth and character to something, and so that's just one example of a really useful plugin. There's so many that we use all the time, but a lot of them there's some great free stuff out there.
It is a rabbit hole, and one of the reasons we like Reaper is all of the plugins that come built in are fantastic, and they're very straightforward UI, very unpretentious looking, but a great compressor. The best digital EQ that I've ever personally used. I really like the interface. They have, again, a very unpretentious digital delay, and they have limiting software. And so there's great stuff built in. I think, like we mentioned, though, before, all of this stuff is a rabbit hole where it's like Epic Verb was great for our purposes. But if you want to go to that next level of like really finding polished stuff, it's like just finding good reverbs is its own art form. And that's what I was saying before, where it's like being a musician is all of these responsibilities. Yeah. And if you made it like a business, you could hire someone whose job is to just pick the best reverb for a situation. And so as a composer, you're doing all these different responsibilities.
It's easy to get sucked into that as a form of procrastination. Very, very, very akin to the kind of hunting for the best gear. Is this idea of finding the best plugin, and I can't make music till I have Contact, complete.
And it's really because sort of you're not confident to make music. That's what it is. You're just lying to yourself. You're much better off as a growing composer to just limit yourself to like 6 plugins. Like, it's crazy to think the music that I made when I first started using Reaper and I didn't have any other plugins. The music that I made with the Reaper EQ, the Reaper compression, maybe the Reaper delay, Epic Verb, maybe like one other. How much music I made with just those bare bones plugins. Sure. And you can make something sound really good with that. You don't need the whole Waves suite. You don't need all these expensive plugins to make something sound good. If you can really get good at using those plugins, knowing how they work, how to get the most out of them, then you're well on your way.
Yeah. Well, guys, I want to be respectful of your time. This conversation has been incredible. It's been 30 minutes longer than I said it would be, so I apologize for that. I have maybe 2 or 3 more questions. Is that okay? And
yeah, go ahead.
Wrap it up?
No problem.
Awesome. Thanks. I really appreciate it, guys. So for you guys, do you typically produce on the piano? Do you ever compose on piano? Do you ever compose on guitar? Do you ever compose just with your voice? Because, sometimes for me, I'll have a melody and I'll sing it into voice memos, and then I'll find the chords kind of later.
Yes.
But
all the time.
All of the above.
Gotcha.
My go-to is piano, and for anything I do, I will probably at some point tend to look at it at the piano. But some of my favorite things are things just that come from singing from your own voice, because you're kind of tapping into an inner musical ear and like an intuitive thing. Sure. And I find that the melodies that I come up with singing are much more evocative, because since it's just a melody line and I don't have chords, my melodies tend to be really intricate and like outlining these chord progressions in a way that if I'm writing on the piano, maybe the chords are satisfying that, so that melody is maybe more simple. I mean, in writing on the guitar, or I've written melodies on trumpet and all manner of things. I think it's good to, I like changing it up so that you don't get stale.
Sure.
Yeah, I think any good composer will tell you that if you just write the same way, you're only going to write one kind of music. Like the stuff that I've come up with on guitar, I never would have come up with on piano.
Yeah,
it just never would have happened.
Same.
Different notes that are in front of you, a way that you can use the notes and bend and ignore keys and come up with like weird chords that you never would have, like, you don't even really know what that chord is. Like with a guitar, you just slide your hand around and you might stumble on something cool and you don't even know what it is. Almost everything that I've written for my band, Carl B. and the Soul Surgeons, I actually did the voice method, where a lot of times I'd be like in my car.
Yes.
And I would just have the voice memo and I would just do something like almost kind of like a beatboxing style.
Yeah.
And just record it. And there's a lot of good ideas that can come that way. I would also agree with Will that most of the time it's on piano, but there's definitely, for me, a large amount that are written on guitar or with my voice.
I am so fascinated. Carl described something that's one of the things I'm most fascinated about music, and something that I think is grossly unexplored in the academic field, which is the understanding of pop music and how much of it was written, particularly guitar-centered stuff. What Carl described is the amount of time, the little amount of time between like doing something with your fingers and getting a neat result that you might not even be able to articulate or explain. That's a really fascinating aspect of music to me, where people are playing with tools that they don't even fully understand, but they can still use them. Yeah. For me, I like to be at a place where I'm always aware of what I'm doing. I don't want to be a composer that's just kind of like blindly writing something.
Yeah.
But I still like using different instruments, because on like an immediate level, maybe when I'm first composing it, I'm not necessarily thinking about that. And then afterwards, I'm thinking about that, just so that in the future, if I want to recreate that kind of thing, and I just have a piano, I understand, what kind of voicing on the guitar was happening that gave that chord its flavor. Was there no third? Was that the sound of it? And the other thing, why that works so well, it has to do with the sonority of the guitar. If you were to play those exact same pitches on the piano, you might think it sounds ugly.
Yeah.
So sometimes we're just the beneficiaries of our tools, and I find that really fascinating.
It's also cool to write on a computer. A lot of times if I'm trying to come up with something really futuristic and shreddy, I've written full like chip tunes, with no instruments, everything sequenced on the computer. And that has a different sound, and sometimes it's cool.
I tend to want to get away from that. I usually will be afraid of writing anything where I'm not interacting with any kind of acoustic thing, whether it's my own voice or whether it's a piano or even just writing something down on pencil, because I don't know, it can...
Well, to be fair, it wouldn't work for most of the types of music you happen to write. But there are some kinds of music where it is really effective, and you come up with different things.
I still personally think that writing into technology, because I can do that when I'm writing in FamiTracker. It's very compelling to just like figure stuff out that way. But there is this thing of like, that doesn't sound good, that doesn't sound good, that doesn't sound good, that sounds good, okay, move on. And it's kind of imprecise, where when I'm writing at the piano, I'm figuring out an arrangement first.
Yeah,
and
it's
then
way
I'm
more
going,
efficient.
Or when I'm writing on the computer, sometimes it's just like, get notes down. Oh, this note sounds bad. Well, move that note half step down. Okay, now it works. Move that up. But it's not an inspired line. It's just kind of like, I don't know. It's just not my favorite process.
I think they both have their place, because I've noticed whenever I try to write things into the computer, it's good for writing things that like a human could almost never do. It's kind of like, and sometimes you want that vibe. Sometimes you just like, I want something that sounds so futuristic that like a human could never do it, and other times you want it to feel very lyrical and that sort of thing.
And that's why in my opinion, it's a good balance.
That's the point of why you would want to do that. Like, Will, what you said of how it's not as inspired and how you're kind of settling, that's the point. You go to different places. Like settling on that note in the beginning meant that now I'm headed to a totally different direction.
But what I'm saying, I'm not saying that I don't write on these tools. What I'm saying, I would never, whether it's Sibelius or Reaper or anything, I would never have no idea what the piece of music is, open a computer, never touch a keyboard, never sing, have no idea, and just start writing. I would probably at the very least have the melody worked out, or maybe a general sense of what the chords are going to be. And then the arrangement, like when I was writing that opera this summer, a lot of times I would have the melodies figured out, or I knew the general musical DNA, and then when I'm writing the oboe part, maybe I'm working on that on the computer, and it's kind of that whittled thing.
Will,
but I don't know.
What's so interesting? You should listen to it. There's a tune just off the top of my head that I can think of on Sonic-esque Volume 3. I will say that I did that probably too much on Volume 3. I did a lot of tunes where I wrote right into the computer. The desert theme from Volume 3, that was written 100% without touching any instrument or singing or at all. I wrote it all on the computer. And I do like that track. I think it's really interesting, but it sounds very different than a lot of the tracks that I would normally write.
I think the lesson too is like, just if you're a beginner or if you're a composer, always be shifting your workflow, right? So try to write something on FamiTracker, try to write something on acoustic guitar, try to write something on the voice, try to write something where recently I would try to write something with a rhythm first, like I just put a drum loop in. That's going to do something different. Try to write a bass part first. Stuff like
I guess
that.
if you're trying to grow and evolve and push yourself outside of your comfort zone, those are great things to do. It's also important though to understand to go back to things that work. So if you're going back revisiting a style or being asked to do a specific thing, you should be able to say, okay, this is the best way for me to get there.
Especially if you're getting paid.
Yeah, and you're only going to know that from, like you said, trying all those different types of workflow. So I think the more ways you can come up with a song, the better. Just keep trying stuff out.
Speaking of getting paid, I know both of you guys have mentioned on the podcast that you've gotten contracts for video game stuff, and that's something that I actually am going to try to pursue here pretty soon. I'm kind of putting together a little demo reel. So Do you have any tips for me or for anyone out there who might be trying to not make a career out of it? Because at least let's start baby steps, right? Just start with getting a paid gig. What are some tips for that?
I think networking. If you have a situation, I sometimes musicians make the mistake of just wanting to network with other musicians, but they're not going to hire you, even if they think you're a genius. So it's like meeting the people who would give you money, meeting developers, designers, artists, people that have ideas and would like music. And whether that's on an online situation, like a certain forum community or some type of social media presence, or literally sending emails to different people. Sometimes it's in person, maybe like if there's a convention, like a video game convention where you have a lot of indie devs that are showing off prototypes or something. It's good to go there, meet those people, let them know that you're interested in what you're doing, and that, you know.
Yeah, I think one kind of sad realization over the years is it's less about if you're good. It really is. It's less about if you're good. And it's even at this point, because it's so competitive, it's not good enough to say, oh, I can write in a bunch of different styles. Yeah, so can this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy.
Sure.
It's about making those connections, ideally having some connections, reaching out to people you know, and being a nice person, being easy to work with. That's more important to the other members of the team than how good you are. Right. If you're a joy to work with, and if you work, meet deadlines and get things done on time, that's much more valuable to those people. So, and unfortunately, it seems to be a little bit less about how good you are and more about, I guess, how hard you work and how much you want it, really.
Sure. If you guys were to do a TED Talk, host a TED Talk about something completely unrelated to video games and music, and that's difficult, right? What would you do?
I've thought about this because just to start to tear down the curtain here, but Matt, you actually sent us some of these questions in advance, and this is the one I think I thought the hardest about. Because it's like, first of all, I would never be asked to do a TED Talk for anything other than music. I suppose if I did, it would either be about like film, or I think it would probably be about like philosophy. And something that I'm really fascinated in philosophy is about creating in general, whether not just specifically music, but artists, authors, filmmakers, the idea of their kind of moral responsibility to the art that they create is something I'm really passionate about and kind of fascinated by. So maybe that would be.
I would watch that TED Talk.
I think one thing that I would do, and this is something that, to be honest, came out of conversations relating to music, but I would try to relate it to other things. It would be hard to do, but I would try to have some sort of framing of, just because something is mainstream and universal, and maybe you could also frame it something for kids, it doesn't mean that it's not hard. It doesn't mean that it's easy to do.
I changed my answer. That I think I'm more passionate about
that.
Okay.
So you might show examples of like Pixar movies or various different kinds of art and media, things that are
a defense of popular art.
Yeah, popular things that are popular and that everyone loves, and trying to
the
defend
Beatles,
that.
Star Wars,
defend that.
Well,
no, the Beatles doesn't work. That's music, Will.
Well, no, but
I'll make an
it's
exception
broad,
for this because the topic
it's a broad topic.
Just trying to defend things that are really popular and beloved, and maybe some people would say simple or universal, in the fact that it's actually really difficult to make something that everyone loves.
Right.
I get infuriated going to music school because there are so many elitist professors. There are so many arrogant people that I think have no business teaching, because they're incredibly dismissive of the type of thing that inspires people to get into the music in the first place.
Sure.
There's this like derisive tone against anything that, it's not even just popular, but anything beautiful, anything that is playing off of, tried and true emotional, things. And they'll be dismissive of film music. They'll be dismissive of popular songs. They'll, in a way that isn't actually intellectual. There's nothing
It's
more
almost like this
complex
weird
or intelligent about that argument. It's just sort of an attitude that conveys
they want to
like
be
this
separate
closed
from the
off
masses.
energy. Yeah,
really,
I don't care what anybody else is doing. I'm doing my own brilliant thing.
It's like a weird mutated like cousin of being a hipster, really, is what it is. It's just like, oh, that's popular. I'm not going to like it just because it's popular.
Yeah.
It's really what it is.
Right.
Well, and it's a group of people that want music to be something only for people that went to school. You know, you can only like this music if you've studied it, if you understand the theory.
That's not what makes music good.
I want to write music that someone that understands theory and they can actually find neat things about it, and they can say, "Oh, I love this thing here," but I also want to be able to share it with my dad, and he would say, "That's a snappy tune." I think that's what a cool song. That's my goal at all times. I want to be like doing both the things because there is value to the intellectual pursuit of music as a craft, as a discipline, as an art. But I passionately believe that should not be at the exclusion of your average listener, your average audience member.
Absolutely.
Carl once said to me, one of the greatest compliments, I don't know if he intended it as a compliment, but for me, I really took it as a compliment. And it's part of my core philosophy. He said, Will, as a composer, I feel like you're like a listener. You compose music in like almost like an impatient way. Like with my own music, I have very little patience for things that are boring. I have very little patience for an undeveloped idea. Like I always want it to be interesting. I always want it to be accessible. So I really took that as a compliment. Now, somebody else might have said like, oh, maybe I need to start doing something more complex or, vague or obscure. But I took that as like, yeah, that's really what I want.
Wow. So last question, very important. What do you guys think of Sonic Mania?
Love it. So fun. When I first bought it and started playing it, I literally felt like I was a kid again. I felt like I was transported back.
It brought a tear to my eye. I'm not gonna lie, it brought a tear to my eye. It feels
like a classic Sonic game. It just really does. I really enjoy all the weird changes to the classic levels, weird places that you never went to before, different enemies. The remixes are really fun. I mean, he's always been so great at arranging the classic Sonic melodies. So I'm really loving the remixes. The new music is very cool too. It's definitely, it's not the style of Sonic music that I grew up with, but that doesn't mean I don't like it. I think it's really
kind
cool.
of in the Sonic CD vein. A lot of it's very jazzy and
it's not it's not the super kind of Sonic music that we sing the praises of all the time. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't the right choice for that game.
And it is really good. I've been really cool. I've thoroughly enjoyed the soundtrack. I love his central theme. I think that's really fantastic. Yeah. And
however, Studiopolis, it's got some tasty dissonance.
It's very it's really very fun. Funky. Yeah. So, however, one thing I will say is maybe just to bring it more of a positive light. I won't say anything against that game, but I would love to see another Sonic game that went for the old school, like classic Masato style of Sonic music.
It is a little bit strange to me that you have these kind of chip sounds and these old Sega Genesis tunes, and then the new stuff sounds so different. I feel like it's a little bit of a missed opportunity because the game is so retro. Like it's not like Sonic 4 or something where it's a 2D game, but it's kind of updated visuals. Like no, they're trying to make it look like it came out in 1994.
Yeah, but honestly, I was a little curious Sonic why they didn't go back with the chiptune music for this.
It's all because Sonic CD. If it wasn't for that game, then so much would have been different. I do think it was a love letter to specifically Sonic CD even more than the others. And that's why the musical direction went that way. So, again, I think it was the right choice for the game they made. I would love to see another game that goes back to just the classic, really happy melodic. Because the thing about T's music, at least in this game, is he wasn't really trying to make things that catchy or melodic. He was trying to make it groove-based, jazzy, soloistic, fresh and fun.
Right.
And he totally nailed that.
Yeah.
But Masato's music is so different than that.
Yeah.
Something I do love just about that main theme again, because it goes da 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 da, and then it has that da 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 da, and then that chord, that kind of atmospheric chord that lays out. It's sort of like the Neapolitan chord or like the flat 2, where basically instead of cadencing on the 1, we cadence on a chord that's half step above.
It's hip.
It's this really wonderful moment. I can't explain why, but it's just like, it's so perfect for that sequence. That might be my favorite thing about the entire game, is just that opening splash screen.
Well,
that's
and
like
the
what
last
makes
thing
it
I'll
feel
say,
so legit.
If I was going to write a testimonial, Will brought this up before. The reason why I think Sonic Mania is a rousing success on every level is because at the end of the day, it's cool, right? The music is cool.
Yeah.
It might not be what I would have done, but it's really cool and it fits the bill, and I just adore the game.
Absolutely. So if people want to learn more about you guys, well, let me ask one more question, and that kind of leads into this. So you guys have a podcast, almost 300 episodes, which is insane, on top of your 30 albums. How do you stay so prolific with this music and disciplined? Because you guys seem very disciplined. You just come in,
I think,
you grind out the podcast day in and day
miserable.
out.
We're depressed.
We hate each
and
other.
Exhausted. Yeah.
At the expense of all of our relationships. No, I'm very fortunate that I know for me personally, I've always been that way. I've always been just very driven, and I finish every project I start. And that's quite rare for artists. A lot of times they never finish their projects, but for me, I always finish my projects. I was so lucky that Will happens to be the same way. Yeah. We just have this personality of, we're very driven. Yeah. We work really hard, really fast, and we finish our projects. And if it wasn't for that, I don't think this would have worked out.
I think the difficult thing in doing that is just doing something fast is one thing, but doing something fast that is good and that you can be proud of is really exhaustive. And sometimes I feel like I commit to too many things, but it almost always works out. And then in my sick mind, I use that as a justification for why I live my life the way I do. It's just commit to too many things, be stressed out, and it'll work. And
it always does.
I don't even know. I don't know how it works. I mean, at the beginning of the summer, I had to write this opera. That was like my summer project. And I was terrified. I had no idea how to begin doing it. And people that had known me or were trying to be supportive were saying, I know you can do it. I know you're going to do it. And it didn't help. But I mean, I did finish it, and I am proud of it. But it's like that can't be a defense for why I would say yes to something like that, because it feels like it was by a thin margin, you know.
Yeah,
if I would have slacked off a couple more days, it wouldn't have been finished.
The reason why Will, particularly like Will and myself, I mean, Marty is involved in the Marcato brothers, especially when we have original albums, we always try to include Marty. But day to day, you know, Will and myself are really kind of the main two partners of this. The reason why that has worked so well for the podcast and the music is that we are just on the same page as far as our urgency. When we have an episode, we just are really passionate about it. We pour our heart and soul into it. When we're working on music, we pour our heart and soul into it, and we work fast and efficiently.
And it's a routine. The podcast is a part of my life, just like brushing your teeth. Sure. At first, it's like it seems like a lot, but it's really not that much time. It's collectively a lot of time, but once it becomes part of your life, it's just like any other thing that you have
We've
to
also
do.
gotten better at making it be more efficient. So our recording sessions are virtually real time. If it's an hour episode, it takes an hour to record, done. The editing has gone from like 4 hours to less than real time. So, I mean, we've just gotten so used to doing this podcast, and we're really good at doing this podcast, you know? So
see, I do Underscore with Marty, and that's a completely different story. That show requires a lot of editing and a lot of research, and it's a lot. It's an insane amount of work. I mean, that would be something that if that keeps going, I kind of would like to see if we could get some sort of like grant or something, because it becomes like almost a full-time job when we're doing it. But it has its own rewards. But I think the cool thing about our podcast is we've been doing it long enough, like Carl said, where We just make time for it. And I find doing all of my other things, whether it's school related or different composition jobs or projects I have, or doing underscore, that when I come back to the Super Marcato Brothers, I feel recharged. And sometimes I feel like my best episodes are when I'm stressed out about other things in my life, or I feel like, the piece I'm working on isn't going in the way I want. But then for whatever reason, my brain is just in this place where then maybe I'm really articulate on that episode, and I feel like I'm making good points, where other times it's the opposite, where I'm really excited about a piece that I'm doing, or I'm working hard on something, and my brain just like isn't there for the podcast.
So if people
usually when one thing is good, the other is bad.
Right. That's how it always goes, yin and yang. If people want to learn more about you guys, what you do, your podcast, where should they go? Where would you direct them?
I would go a couple places. I would check out our social media presence on Twitter at Marcato Bros. Like us on Facebook. Our podcast is on iTunes. You can subscribe to it there. We also have a YouTube channel. I would also check out our website, supermarcatobros.com. You can read a little bit about us and listen to our podcast and our original music. And if you're interested, you can even send us an email there, too.
Yeah, and Marcato is spelled Marcato, not like mercato, like the Spanish word for market, but Marcato, like the Italian musical accent. And then we also each have individual composer pages. My website is called William B Music. My website URL is williambmusic.com, and Carl's is carlbmusic.com. So it's pretty easy to keep track of.
Awesome. Well,
indeed.
Carl and Will, this has been an incredible conversation. I think
Thanks, man.
The video game community is going to be able to extract a lot of just really helpful best practices and tidbits out of this. So thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for asking us. This was a real treat.
You got it.